President, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, will you please welcome John Bowman.
Uachtaráin a Geróid agus a Córdia. I would like to first of all thank President Higgins for his generosity in inviting me to chair these Machnamh seminars. It was over a number of years, as you know, COVID intervened and threatened to derail. But in fact, we can discuss this because I'm going to be talking to Geróid and to the President presently. But in fact, I think that COVID became, I won't quite say a friend, but it kept an audience there available with lots of hours to tune in, and it turned what might have been a different type of event into largely a television program in a way. I saw it as a sort of at last a television program which could go on instead of having wind-ups and signals that you had only so many minutes left. But let me also just say as a part of the introduction that the most important part, by the way, of this document here that you have is the last page, which gives access permanently and in all sorts of formats to the Machnamh seminars. I should also say that this is Machnamh, although it brought a lot of historians to this house and to this campus, it was not the first occasion of importance in search of the truth that historians assembled in Áras and Uachtaráin, because it's not that well known, not that well publicized. But an earlier president did invite a number of historians. Where the initiative came from, I'm uncertain. But in Éamon de Valera's time, a group of historians came up to interview de Valera. And I remember talking about this to Desmond Williams, who was one of the historians involved. And I'm afraid I cannot remember de Valera's answer, but I do remember Desmond Williams' question. Because the question was, looking back, Mr. de Valera, on your long career, can you tell us what you believe was your greatest error of judgment, if any? So I do remember the if any, yes. Now, Machnamh will have a residual effect in all sorts of ways because it's going to be available, as you will see from this, it's going to be available in so many different formats, and on the President.ie Machnamh site particularly, it will be there, I believe, indefinitely. So it means that for indefinitely, scholars and students and those interested in other ways will be able to access all the Machnamh events. And what that impact is going to be is, of course, difficult to evaluate, but they will be able to look at different chapters and so on. Whether modern media generally is the friend of history, it's, again, difficult to say. If one thinks, say, of something like a blockbuster film like the Michael Collins film, how can historians, through scholarship and individual volumes, no matter how their print run might be or their circulation might be, how can they compete with the memory and the residual effect of a film on that scale? And I just, before coming to the interview with the President and with Geróid, might mention that I was asked once, just after the Collins movie, which I did not personally like, I was asked by the committee in Brewery, would I come to chair an event there between Joe Lee. The event was about modern Ireland, it was not about the Collins movie. But would I come and chair an event there to discuss Ireland in the 20th century? And I said I would. I said, but on two conditions. And I knew well that they would be more than interested in, but I said, I will do it gratis, but I will do it on two conditions. One is that if I ever do another book on de Valera, that you will keep it, copy it, and have it available for sale in the library, in your bookshop, no matter what you think of the book. And you won't be endorsing it, but I would like that. And secondly, I want to speak for 10 minutes before the event about the Collins movie and its depiction of De Valera. Now, I well knew that this would be a plus for them, but I pretended that it was a condition for me. And of course they said yes. And then I was down at a supper before we got into the event. And I got a call from the Irish Times saying, I believe you're talking about De Valera, the Collins movie and De Valera, before this happens tonight. What are you going to say? And I said, look, I couldn't summarize it. But so I didn't know, and I was surprised by the call. We went in and we did the event. And a week later, I was in the RT library, and I was just leaving, and I was walking out. I saw a wastepaper basket, and with a headline, and the word just caught my eye. Bowman was the word, right? I was astounded. It was like a joke newspaper, and it was a copy of the Limerick Leader, country edition, on the previous Wednesday, saying, Bowman to defend De Valera in Brewery. So I put it in my briefcase, and I was told later that it was not in the city edition. But I kept it anyway. But I want to say this to people like you who are often on committees. If such an event, I'm disappointed in a way that the committee never told me or had a copy of it for me. Because, of course, it's quite a prized possession for me to show to my grandchildren. But that's a huge headline copy with Bowman to defend De Valera and Brewery. So I thought I'd share that with you. So I'm now going to take my seat here and invite the President and Geroid to talk about Machnamh and its possible impact and its some of the background to it. President Higgins, first of all, what was your original idea behind Machnamh? What did you want it to achieve?
I think I wanted to get the widest possible audience for the new work that I knew had taken place on a number of particular themes. And in a way, a new critical scholarship had emerged. Now, some of it was new research. Other pieces of the work, I thought, were very much people who had reworked their positions, taking account of what were obviously newly discovered manuscripts, accounts, diaries, and whatever. And very, very much, if we wanted then to get the best use of all this was to share it, and to share it in a significant way as possible with the public. I was very conscious of an important distinction in my mind, and that was those who set out to honour somebody, which is a particular purpose. Another is to celebrate a happening that is there in collective memory. And then another part of it might be, in fact, actually to pay tribute in a very direct way. But I wanted, if as it were, to try and recover context. What was the atmosphere? What do we know now about the atmosphere insofar as we have probably many more new facts? We also have people who have offered recollections. And very, very early on in that first section, when we were dealing with memory, and there is, for example, there's the trap of memory, because it is the event is over and it's being recalled. So there's the problems of recall. Then, in addition to that, there is with whom it has been communicated. So you have personal memory, collective memory. You have memory being used for a particular purpose. What I was very conscious of, and I can see now where we're on such what is a celebratory occasion on the publication of these two volumes, is of trying to be as authentic as one could in relation to the facts and the events in their period. In other words, not to look at it through a filter of fitting the past to suit the present. And I sensed that in a way that there was very, very much. It is something that arises in other parts of history as well, where you feel you have, as it were, to fall over backwards so as to make sure that the previous antagonism you had didn't exist, and so on. So, in a way, I used the phrase then about the hospitality of memory. What I meant by that was very, very much is that rather than formal accounts, what was easy to access in the first goes of the history, what about the women, for example, who had been left out? What about working people? What about the people who went about their work every day, immigrants and so forth? In other words, the voices from below. And that was the way my mind was working. But I also wanted, I knew, and I'm very pleased that you mentioned, indeed, that Dáil Áras inviting historians here. I wanted something significant to be there after we had done that we would have a hospitality of narrative, that we would do it ethically, there wouldn't be attempt, or if there was a distortion, could be quickly discovered and corrected. And then the next part of it is that there would be something substantive that could go to libraries and schools and so on. And I have to say that I think there are about a dozen of them here. I couldn't thank sufficiently the scholars who wrote the papers and wrote their papers with the generosity of saying, we hope to publish your paper. And they did the work afterward. You yourself, John, in chairing those sessions. But from the very beginning, this is important. When I had this idea in my mind, there had been meetings here in Áras and Uachtaráin of the committee that was advising government. But I felt that this was something that I could do, and I went to Garrod immediately. Garrod and I, as I said, Dean Cara agus Sean Collected agus ni féidir le mar cupúchas atá with a Garrod as a Cara hug. And when Garrod, immediately what we said is that he heard some themes from me, we discussed them. So we said these are the themes, but our next thing, and this is where he could be most valuable to me then, is that who has been publishing centrally on this and who has been used to doing new work. And our whole point was that we would have a diversity of opinion. And we did, I believe, achieve that.
A contested opinion, yes.
Yes.
Perhaps the audience doesn't know this, but these two men, when they were a little bit younger, were the demon debaters from UCG. That was the team.
Yes, we did.
Isn't that right? In a golden age of university debating.
We were robbed, of course. by UCD with Ellen Hitchcock. We did. We made it to the semi-final.
Made it to the semi-final. So anyway, Geroid.
I think the president has very comprehensively given the context within which the series was embarked on. It might be no harm to remember, though, that from the point of view of the president and the role of the president and the office as a key fulcrum within which this Machnamh or reflection could take place, that throughout the period of the decade of centenaries, obviously, the president was going to be present at numbers of state occasions and formal occasions in which he would make a speech or make a... These are generally events that are context-bound. There is a certain formality, not to say a formulaic character to them. There's a ceremonial dimension. And the performative context for them, if you like, is not discursive. It's about making a statement. Is it not indeed that those speeches were not likely to provide over Machnamh or room for or food for thought? It's simply that the actual context of them largely framed them, if not confined them. So that what was envisaged by the president before this began to take shape at all was something that would be more open and more discursive. And the way to do that, if possible, was to have a series of reflections of a discursive kind. And it was urgent, and I think you're right, Uachtaráin, it was urgent and indeed necessary because there had been such a huge quantity and such, if you like, challenging originality in the publications of the last generation and a half on all of these. One, for example, would only need to look at the materials available in 1966 for the 50th anniversary and the historical and the distinguished historians at the time, and to see what had happened in the intervening period in terms of the kind of research that was being done, the areas that had been long neglected or suppressed, voices that had not been heard and that were now re-emerging. So there was an urgency about at least making that part of a wider discussion, and I think the President saw that and grasped it and saw the discursive context as one in which it should take place. And of course, as he rightly said, extremely fortunate to have a cohort, a willing cohort of distinguished scholars and thinkers who were prepared to participate in this. And I think that made it such a very unique episode in terms of public discussion of important and complex matters, but with a wide access, John, as you rightly say. And also there was probably one other matter that perhaps the President might say a little few words on, that is a presiding reflex of his public pronouncements and his general address to the Irish public throughout the presidency, and that is this notion of the ethical commemoration. What is an ethical commemoration? How do we have an ethical reflex in thinking about the past and in thinking about controversial and contested matters? You might say a little word on that. By way of aside, which has absolutely, I am a wee bit in shock, because notwithstanding the fact that I have great regard for the editor of the time of the county edition of the Limerick Leader, I am astonished that anybody would think De Valera needed defending in brewery, but that's by the by as it were, even from John Bowman, but that's by the by as it were. If I could ask you, the President, that ethical dimension was
Yes.
embedded in from the beginning, wasn't it?
Oh, very much so. I think it began, I suppose, first of all, one of the great advantages of we all being here is that we all recognize the importance of history, and may it always be so, and the importance of historical research and for a diversity of publications. But I was also interested in a philosophical aspect and an ethical aspect, and I am interested in that area, both in ethics of speech and ethics of publication, and it's for another day in relation to the ethics of communication and the challenges of the ethics of communication in relation to publication and publics. But in that sense, what I had in mind was that a piece of work emerges objectively, it is interpreted, it is offered with authenticity by the author, whoever she or he is. And where you're coming to then is that so that it would not be abused or manipulated or used for a purpose for which the person had participated in the research, and so that interested me. So when I was saying as well is that one should use, for example, recollected events and the interpretation of them and the response to the interpretations of them in a way that's set out to try and discover a deeper truth rather than to use it as an instrument of enmity or an instrument for just idle, as it were, casual destruction and so on. And that is important, and I said it from the very, very beginning. The other part of it was what I have hinted at already, is there is a suggestion. I gave it a practical challenge in a way by saying one thing we can't have is amnesia. The kind of colloquial phrase, put it all behind you, we must put it all behind us, it's offensive. And I always used, way before I began this project, on the idea of offence of saying to people in the Northern Ireland, for example, who have lost a partner, who have somebody in a wheelchair, somebody's been injured or whatever like that, to say to anybody who has had a loss, to say that I would regard it as morally unacceptable to some extent to be satisfied with saying something like that. So in that sense then, what one had to do was to try and say, can we in fact reimagine the space of all of these events in a way in which we will allow a diversity of different recollections to come off each other. I was very influenced, I have to say, before I began all of this, when in the first presidency, by a paper I'd given, drawn heavily on the work of Hannah Arendt, and that long discussion because very now and again in popular press people would say, well, we must forgive and that. But there wasn't much work. Hannah Arendt did the work on forgiveness and the impossibility and the difficulties and so forth. And so that had come into this. That's how I used the word ethical in the first sense. It was very much, and then also we had the Ricair's big work. And of course, we were very lucky. Joe Blairson came to the very first session, and he took on these issues. What is memory? How do you do memory? And how do you do it in a way that meets
and we had an odd, I mean, one of the best publications, unfortunately, it was not unfortunately, but it happened to be in a Studio Hibernica, I think, but F.X. Martin on 1916, and there were 16 persons, men, actually, now that I think of it, I was saying persons for political correctness in case I was leaving out the women, but there were no women in the RIC. But as it happens, there were 16 men in the RIC for every one in the GPO in 1916. And he brings out the national amnesia of families that did not know their own past. And it's just a very striking statistic, but he develops that very tellingly. So we had, and I remember the RTE minutes in the board meeting when RTE was celebrating 1916, celebrating is the wrong word, but commemorating 1916, it was talking about that it would be in the spirit of, I've forgotten the exact phrase that was used, but it was quite surprised to me that Theo Moody, who was a member of the board of the RTE Authority at the time, sort of went along with it, because it was to celebrate the nationalism of 1916 and not the socialist dimension. Despite a lot of achievements in the television coverage of 1966.
Yeah.
The 50th anniversary.
Yeah, I think when we were talking, President, there is, I suppose, when you move chronologically, there was something monumental and frozen about the narrative of 1916, 50 years on and so on. But then 1916 is a very particular, dramatic, almost theatrical episode. The complexity was more easily, if I can put it that way, or more comfortably teased out. Complexity of different levels and so on, voices, marginalization, social class, women, when you come to the later phase, to 1919 to 22. Because in that case, you are looking at the micro-histories of place, you're looking at the personal testimonies, including the personal testimonies that were becoming available through the record of the pensions files and the army stuff, but also with a huge tsunami of local publications from different people with different points of view and different backgrounds, but essentially all of it producing a much richer and a much more complex and contradictory mosaic of the way in which the historical process unfolded. And that was precisely the kind of setting within which you were most comfortable, that essentially you did need to look at and to listen to these various perspectives.
I think, for example, that without a doubt, the papers, that's the value, I think, of the full 2 volumes, is that the papers challenge each other. And they do for example, without a doubt, you could sustain the suggestion that class has not been given sufficient attention in relation to Irish history. You could do it in relation to another more subtle thing, which was very important, was the prevalence of attitudes associated with property and land. I know very much one of the most moving parts of writing, and the contributions I made myself, was really writing about the people who emigrated, and also the people, for example, remember, who didn't get land, and the people who lost their jobs, and all of this, which was very important.
And the Land Commission records, which are so important.
The Land Commission
records
become
available.
I think that was one of the suggestions that has come out of the thing.
Of this,
very, very important when the records are very, very, very important. I think as well there's something there's more, where people want to take it all further, which they can, in relation to, for example, the suggested importance of respectability and what was respectability. I was very anxious that would come out, because there was respectability of property, respectability of compliance with absolutely restrictive conditions in relation to sexual behaviour. Also in relation to where I think I do say it very, very well. I think in number 5 and number 6, where we are envisaging the 1930s. And if you think of what the 1930s released in many cases, you would say, was it like the conservative stability of the second half of the 20s, the unwillingness to confront issues of poverty, exclusion, emigration, and so forth, that created a kind of composure that would then, in itself, become would consume, as it were, living, breathing societies, change relations between genders, have a certain attitude towards what was a failure and how were you to interpret immigration. Was it in this period? Have they gone to where they're going to lose their soul? And we're taking their receipts at the same time, just in case. But the fact of it is that when that all comes to an acute point in public manifestations in the 1930s. So I think there is a way in which these papers are very, very, I was so grateful that people came forward with them in a way. And something that I think is important in history, and that is people wearing their vulnerabilities. When I look back at how different events have been celebrated in Ireland, there is a kind of a natural enthusiasm for the local heroic, but on the other side, it's for the local suffering and because they're gone, and it's many cases, or they've lost, or they're at a disadvantage. That is, we're back again to the idea that the fullness of the historical account has to carry some kind of ethical impulse.
I think there's also something, perhaps when those who are not familiar with who didn't see the full series will read, there is an anxiety sometimes expressed that the sheer volume of personal histories, the compelling part of the story, the individual story, and the fact that was facilitated by documentation. Yeah. That one of the risks of the historiography, the benefits everybody is, complexity in the mosaic is saluted. But one of the risks is that there is such if you like, a sheer plenitude of individual stories, all of them compelling and all of them engrossing, that the ideological larger narratives, which were probably too calcified in the older historiography, were left aside or elided. Now, I think that's not something that the contributions to the Machnamh series could be accused of, because the larger context of empire within which these events took place and should be considered, the immediate contexts in Ireland of partition and the northern experience right through this to partition. These are given not only their place, but they are teased out and considered by those who have written about them, who have reflected on them, and who encapsulate or distill their findings and their insights into contributions. So that one can argue about the balance, but the balance between the particularity of local circumstances, which enriches the sense of complexity, and the larger, if you like, almost imposed coherence of some ideological lens through which to see these. That's a difficult balance to achieve. It's a difficult balance to achieve even in a single volume. It's very difficult in a volume of collected essays and papers. But it is one that was kept in view, as it were, all the way through the series. And I think it is, as the President has said, it's a measure of the generosity of the contributors and of their immediate, if you like, identification of what was required. Essentially, did you get that?
I just want to correct one point. I made a mistake there a few minutes ago when I was talking about the 16-1. That's not the RIC. It was the Great War and
It's the War of the
1916,
Numbers, yes.
for F.X. Martin, but it's a terrific essay from 1966 and ought to have been really collected within a book, I think, itself.
And I think there is something that Garrett has said that is very, very important. I think John Horn's paper, for example, have said, is that there was a very, very deliberate attempt in choosing the themes and asking the contributors, because that we weren't on our own as things were happening. There were great events taking place in Europe. The discussion on empire was taking place. The proximity of Ireland as the most challenging component of the most successful empire is a context, is a part of context that can't be ignored. And then as well, I think perhaps we tried, I don't, maybe did it get enough? It is that history is as much about those who sought peace as those who sought war. For example, we did discuss in a number of the papers the different attempts to avoid the war.
Avoid the Civil War.
And then the several efforts during the Civil War, the destructiveness of what was happening in many cases and the attempts. And you also had, as it were, in a critical on the Clune affair in relation to Monsignor Clune's proposals for peace, the notion that the military view would be a military victory as possible, when in fact, actually, even if it would have cost so much less, was possible. So, and again, there are very insightful lessons.
And it's beginning, isn't it? This is a book about questions as much as it is about answers, isn't it?
Yes, I think so, and I think that the other side of it is being if you like, there is the vulnerability that at any one time that a person is aware of as a person, but there is the vulnerability that is shared. I had a particular concern very, very much for those, as I've said, as the 1923 Land Act was going to be featuring, as I was coming to numbers 5 or 6, you had the domain land still to be divided, and we had that very fine paper in relation to the land around the big house and so forth, and the pressure on that. But we had thousands of people in prison, and in addition, as people came out, it was that you could argue that there is room for reflection, not only in really what the push for land and the security it offered gave not only in Ireland but in all the countries in Europe. Because you could look and see in relation to the French rural history, and you could see the same. And then I thought of something too, very, very much as I was listening to the papers, about something I've looked at elsewhere, that is in relation to, apart from the social sciences, we had people who were writing literary accounts. And the literary accounts were telling us sometimes, for example, after the events that took place in the foundation of the state, they took on a heroic quality. I think that my friend, Padre O'Donnell, for example, the gates flew open, is very different than, for example, Joseph Campbell's account of his account in relation to the Curragh and so on. And so that there is that tendency to make our history niche that we have to kind of resist to.
We might also say, I suppose, now that they're available with the seal of Áras and Uachtaráin and the President, that it was not envisaged, nor is it the case, of course, that this was to form an official orthodoxy, a new orthodoxy, even a new consensual account based on scholarship and so on. As you rightly said, it was about raising questions and inviting a continuing questions. The splendid preparation and the crest and so on does not in any sense represent intellectually an imprimatur of any kind or any particular version or interpretation of history. It is in fact simply the sign of the house inviting. It's a tealach, an open house for discussion of alternative views. One thing that did occur to me, and I think the President has put his finger on it, was the notion of valorising the heroic, and more particularly valorising victory, even victories, small victories, and sacrifice as victory, rather than simply considering the losers, as it were. The late Brendan O'Hare was great for getting societies, imaginary societies, and one of his proposals was the Sean O'Dear and Glanna Society, those who were worsted in the game. And he thought it should have in Ireland a large membership, a very large membership. That's as the case may be. But it is the case that you do need to consider those who were worsted in the game of all sides, yes, persuasions and so on, north and south and elsewhere. Might I, John, just ask one, probably from my point of view, one thing before we conclude? It would be a pity to miss it. And I suppose all of us hearing your speeches over the years, Michael, and more particularly after looking at the way in which this was envisaged and so on, probably are aware of the fact that in addition to the public importance of this kind of discussion being prompted and hosted and encouraged by the first citizen, which is itself a very important point from the point of view of civic virtue and the sense of the Republic. There is always, in this period, because of historical circumstances of your own, there is, if you like, a set of familial and indeed filial currents coursing through your own engagement with this period and its aftermath in particular. And I think that meant something very special to you, in addition to the public role of hosting such a series of Machnamh, as it were, or reflections, that there was that familial and filial set of reflexes, sharpening your engagement with it. Would that be a fair comment? And
oh, I think it is, and it is fair. I think it's a question as well that more or less something that when I mentioned it in I think in the fifth paper, it wasn't a case of it being knocked out of me or being revealed. It is something that has to be transacted. And it's something that, in my case, the case is not finished at all. It is the fact that my family's connection with Áras follows. My mother's a very, very young woman, was the secretary of the County Court, but most importantly, my father and his family, there were 10 in my father's family. Only my father had children, and my brother, my uncle Peter, they were officers in the War of Independence. My uncle in the East Clare Brigade. My father began in the East Clare Brigade, as did his brother and my aunt. They all were involved in the War of Independence, starting off in East Clare. Then my father, who was trained in bar and grocery, was moving through different shops and managerial positions, was in Charleville, and he was the intelligence officer of the battalion in what was the Cork No. 2 Brigade that became the Cork No. 4 Brigade. And then during the war, when the Civil War started, my uncle Peter joined the National Army in 1922, and he's in Renmore Barracks in the 1st Western Brigade. And then, but my father has continued, and he's taken the other side, and he is the intelligence officer for the battalion, and he's at this stage. He had started in the company in Charleville, so he's continuing right to the end of the Civil War. He's arrested in February in Liscarroll with my mother's brother, at that stage, there are only 3 members still free. There is Mr. Motherway, the commandant, there's the adjutant, Mr. Smith, and there's my father, who's the intelligence officer. So he spent some time in Limerick jail, and the anxiety of my aunts at the time are very much, he was at risk in Limerick because of his rank as the intelligence officer. So then he's moved to the Curragh, and he is from late February 1923 until the 21st of December 1923 in the Curragh. And he's released at just before Christmas, and then his mother died just in the following January, 1924. But the interesting thing about where it all comes together, in a way, is that at this stage, when everyone is back in Newmarket of Fergus, County Clare, my father comes home from the Curragh and so on. By now there's a great deal of land agitation. Kevin Higgins has set up a special unit to deal with land agitators. My father's name has been handed in all of the time as being person most likely involved, which means he has to leave his parish. So he leaves his parish and he goes off then. And it's a very interesting thing about many of the people in the trades. It's an important distinction in the history, in a way, is that anyone who had some land left the Curragh, went back to the land. But dear friends like my father's, Paddy O'Brien and Ned Geary and people like that in Cork. But if you didn't, supposing you weren't going to get your job back as a manager of a shop or a traveller. But in the case of when I look at the Kerry's figures, for example, 2/3 of those who are officers have emigrated to the United States. And therefore, a great deal of the reason why you have very, very many people with, what were people to do? They wouldn't get a job, so they tried to rent. That's why you got so many Republican publicans, because they would rent a space and try and open their own business. And certainly in the case of Mr. Motherway, a whole series of ones that my father would have talked to me about. But I have to say this, which is maybe I didn't put in the paper when I was giving it, is the damage to the health of the people involved was incredible. Both in the case of my own family members had very chronic. They were living in dugouts during the War of Independence. They had very, very serious health issues. Then, for example, my father married my mother in 1938, which is 15 years after they first knew each other, and so forth. There is a huge issue then in relation to which so many good scholars are working on now in relation to the disgraceful behaviour in the pension applications. I just say that in the case of my father was given a pension in 1960. He had asked to appear before the police to show who, and they kept asking, the bureaucracy was incredible, it kept asking people to produce witnesses and papers that had long been lost. And he died in 1964. But even before that, he'd had a stroke. And I remember the bureaucracy was such that when he had the stroke, and we were youngsters down inside, trying to cash the check, things that you had to, with the next, you had to get a doctor's certificate. And I do think it was very, when I was looking, some people say, have you any papers? I do. And they said, when my father died in January 1964, he was owed £9 and 4 shillings, and it ended up as £3 2 and threepence, because income tax had come in, and there was and for the £3 2 and threepence, my mother had to ask a question: had she taken out probate to my father, who had nothing? But I just only say that to complete the thing.
That's for your memoirs. That has to be for your memoirs.
Well, I don't know whether but it is the thing. This is when I say that this is to be transacted very, very, very much. It's today, the people who are our citizens today, and it's a great privilege to be present in Ireland in many cases, is that It is the texture of their lives, and that is my hope for the Machnamh series in many cases, that introduces people who read it to a feeling for texture.
Yeah.
And there's, that the people have had different experiences in different circumstances and different things like that. But they're trying to make something out of their lives. And I think that the ones then abroad, in many cases, you had the notion about whether or not it was right to go to America. And that didn't change until 1925, when you had to have a certificate from the IRA to say that you were either ill or that you were going to organise. And that was interesting. One of the letters to my father is there are some people agitating, trying to say, can De Valera lift this restriction? And actually it didn't matter in the end, because he was writing letters saying the officers must tell all the people there to stay in the country and everything like that. And people were writing to him from Donegal, and Kerry said, the officers are already gone, so there's nobody to tell the other people to stay. But I think in it all, the way I say it now, and I say it just so as to end this in a certain way about it, you have to be able to take all the lumpiness of the experience of today and yesterday, the whole shit. It was never niche. And it will never be niche in history. But history is so essential. And I think that history has a value that is beyond itself as narrative. I think it is an impulse, and the impulse towards wanting to understand the other. And the sharing, in fact, of, in many cases. And out of it too, which is that something you were mentioning, I'm not a practical historian, but some people have created beauty out of history. In other words, that there is out of the truth of the telling, an even certain kind of aesthetic is created, which is quite beautiful in the way something is told or recorded or left there for others to enjoy.
Thank you.
That's too long an answer to the very thing.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I just want to conclude with one. First of all, both of these men have done an enormous amount for history itself and for history in the curriculum, and defended it at some very...
To say one thing before you do things, is that the department has, in fact, and the government has supported us enormously in making possible the publication of these, which will go to the libraries and go to the schools. And I do wanted to thank the Minister for that. And I wanted to thank RTE, who have been so good to us all the way through, and to the people who are responsible for the RTE player. And they're the people, in fact, who will achieve most of the reach of the thing. Sorry, John.
And the reach is here. But anyway, it is a wonderful experience for me to talk to to be joined with such a wonderful audience and with such speakers. I was once asked some years ago by the history master in my daughter's school, would I talk to the parents about the decline in history, in the curriculum, and the general decline of history? And I said I would be pleased to do that. But I said, what about the audience? Is not the said decline going to minimize the number of people who are going to come and listen to me? And he said, look, you do the paper and I'll do the publicity. So that night in Dublin, there was flash flooding. And my wife said to me, nobody's going to go out and listen to you talking about history tonight. So I said, well, it's been publicized. I will, of course, be going. And when I arrived at the school, I was absolutely delighted because the car park was full. What I did not know was there was a master class in how to get your bust back after breastfeeding. There was another master class in cellulite and another one in stretch marks, what is to be done. And when I went into the house, into the theatre in the school, there were 3 people in the audience. So I read my paper. My wife said to me when I came back, how did it go? I said, terrific. I spoke to all of the audience afterwards. we had a great chat. And sometime later, I was the spouse at a meeting in Paris of the World Psychiatric Association or something. And there were 2,000 psychiatrists at this thing. And Sorbonne, of course, was nearby, and all the attractions of Paris and the bistros and what have you. And I was talking to some man there who was reading a paper, and I said, I spoke recently to an audience of 3. He said, you were lucky. He said, I've just come from room B. And he thought he could see his name in lights. Paper read to the World Conference of Psychiatrists in Paris with the date. He said, and I was talking to an audience of 1. And when I went down to thank the audience for being there, this guy said to me, don't move now, I'm on next.